Going.
Yeah. So welcome to the DeepMed seminar, a history forum for Mediterranean science, strategy and environment, which is hosted by the ERC program DeepMed, which I think most of you know, at least here in the room. Today with us, we have the pleasure of having Pier Luigi Pireddu, who is a doctoral candidate at the Interuniversity Center for the History of Science and Technology in Lisbon, where he's preparing a dissertation on marine ecology and field stations in the Mediterranean and Anglo-American worlds, mostly, I think, late 19th century and early 20th century, which is also very much the topic of his talk today with us.
Yeah.
He has published a number of very interesting articles on this topic and also related topics. For instance, a very recent one on the origins of limnology,
Yeah.
the sciences of the lakes,
Yes.
in Switzerland and Italy, and a debate between different Darwinian interpretations of where does phytoplankton and zooplankton come from. So that's in the Journal of the History of Biology. I don't know if I mentioned that. And we are looking forward to your talk. Thanks very much, Pierre, for your visit.
Thank you. And I'm going to share my presentation. Is everyone able to see, I think? Or
You're
no,
not,
I'm not sure.
you're not
No,
sure.
no, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Okay. Okay, now I should.
Yeah. No, it's
It's
good.
okay?
Yep.
Okay. So again, thank you so much for inviting me and for the presentation. It's a pleasure for me to be here and to have the opportunity to share my research. And as Lino was mentioning, I'm going to talk about my doctoral thesis. And for instance, the title of the presentation is History of Ecology, Exploring Aquatic Environments through the Station Movement across Mediterranean and Anglo-American worlds. And okay, I'm not able to switch. I don't know why. Oh, no, okay. Okay, that's fine. I decided to structure the presentation into four main parts. The first one is, let's say, general historical introduction to the station movement. So I will give a few historical details about this historical phenomena. And then I will explain a little bit the reason why I will focus on aquatic environment and the field research tradition as a perspective through which to watch the history of ecology and the development of ecology as a scientific discipline. And then I will focus on the two main case studies, let's say, one into the case of limnology or lake studies, and then the focus on marine sciences. So that's, for instance, a picture of the very famous biological station in Naples, the station Stazione Zoologica Anton Dohrn. And for instance, the station movement, there is a term that has been introduced by Raph de Bon in one recent book about field research. And with this term, this term is normally referred to the historical scientific phenomenon that emerged in the second half of the 19th century by establishing scientific field research stations. And the first one was founded by Anton Dohrn in Naples. And one of the major purpose of those movements, let's say, as a shared issue, was to promote a study of the organism in their natural environment. So basically, the interaction between organism and the environment was a kind of research project among all of those stations in the field. And that's interesting also to mention this kind of dual historical nature of this movement, because it's a movement that arose in Europe in the second half of the 19th century and then spread in the United States of America a little afterwards. And For instance, Charles Scofield was an American scientist. He worked between Boston and California, and he published this very famous volume that is basically a review of the most important biological station in Europe. And there's literally a list of stations that he visited in the first decade of the 20th century. And let's say that the aim of his trip to Europe was to analyze and studied this phenomenon and apply it in the United States. And in a paper that he published a little bit before his travel to Europe, and he published his famous work, in another article, he said that the fundamental purpose of all biological stations, both marine and freshwater, is essentially the same. They serve to bring the student and the investigator into closer connection with nature, with living things in their native environment. They facilitate observation and multiply the opportunity for inspiring contact with and study of the living world. So basically, the concept behind all of these statement was to promote a, let's say, study of nature in nature, and getting to two major examples in the field of the aquatic environments and biological station. Again, that's probably the best model to address in the context of the biological station, the marine sciences, the Stazione Zoologica Anton Dohr. His foundation, as I said before, was in 1872, and Anton Dohr was the founder and the first director, and probably is the oldest station that is still in activity. And in a paper that Anton Dohr published in Nature, in the journal Nature, he said that the major purpose of the station was to fill the knowledge gap of the knowledge about the animal life of the ocean. Whereas in the context of limnology, the German scientific context is one of the most important, historically speaking. And for instance, Emil Otto Zacharias founded a biological station in Plön. That has been founded in April 1892, and today is known as to be the Max Planck Institute of Limnology. And it's also interesting because they had a little bit after, in the first decade of the 20th century, their own journal where they published their research and also hosted publication from other limnologists all around Europe. And not only that, the archive on hydrobiology, and also they published the research on plankton. For instance, this volume that is famous within the field of plankton research, published in 1907. So we have, like, for on one side, the station built in marine environment, and on the other in lake system studies. And I think that one point of view, at least historically, that it's interesting to address research that has been carried out in aquatic environment and marine sciences is that, assuming that the environment in which research is carried out does not play a passive role, but influences the development of certain ideas and concepts, a study of an aquatic environment, that is a lake or sea, is more inclined to outline an ecological perspective that includes organism and the environment by going beyond the biotic and abiotic distinction. So looking at the aquatic environment, it's possible to see, in a sense, this kind of relationship between the organism and the environment more clearly from an historical perspective. So I will address first the case of limnology and then the case of marine sciences. And in the case of limnology, I will provide first a general context, and then I will discuss briefly the Italian scenario. So for the general context, and starting with the United States of America, Stephen Forbes is considered to be the founder of limnology in the United States, and also one of the first ecologists in that scientific context. And for instance, he published a very famous article that is considered the classics of the limnology and even in the history of ecology, that is entitled Lake as a Microcosm. That's a very famous metaphor. in the history of limnology and ecology. And for instance, with this concept, he described or discussed ecological systems that are complex systems of interactions, where influences occur not only through organisms among themselves, but also among abiotic circumstances. Or it's also possible to say that, according to this concept, there is an organic unity or an equilibrium that emerges at the level of the microcosm. And here I put the whole and also very long quote about this metaphor, where basically emerged more clearly the concept that, according to Forbes, a lake is an environment where there are very well-defined boundaries, and the lake is thought how to be remarkably isolated. And basically the idea that the microcosm is a world within itself. So there are circumstances and the occurrences are not shared with the surroundings. And on the left, there is a reprint of the same article in 1925. But Forbes was also the first director of the Illinois Biological Station, founded in 1894. That was the first American station built on a river. And his main objective was scientific research and also fishery activities. For instance, there's this very famous book, The Fishes of Illinois, that was published in 1908. And switching to Europe, and it's also interesting to see that the development of limnology between Europe and North America occurred simultaneously, contemporaneously, so at the same time. So when Forbes was working on limnological issues in the US, there was Forel, Francois-Alphonse Forel in Europe that was working on lakes systems at the same time. He's considered the founder of limnology in Europe, and his main work is l'Allemand, Monographie limnologique. There is a 3-volume treatise, and in this volume is interesting because he provided the first definition of limnology, and at the same time he was introducing the concept. He coined the term limnology to refer to lake system studies. And in the first volume of the treatise, he said, I have not been able to call my study limnography because the word limnograph is already appropriated for some instruments used in lake measurements. Therefore, I have coined limnology. Limnology, then, is the oceanography of lakes. And it's interesting to see that in the first definition of limnology provided by Forel, there is a reference to oceanography as a kind of disciplinary connection among the two fields. But Forel not only published a volume on limnology, I would say that his bibliography and his publication list 126 titles for limnology. He studied Lake Genève, Lake Léman, but not only that, he did research all around the Alpine area surrounding Switzerland, and the first article was published in 1869 on the bottom farm of the Lake Léman. And after a few years, he detailed a decade-long research program aiming at studying chemical and physical characteristic and biological characteristic of the lake. So providing, like, let's say, a complete picture of a lake system. Going to the Italian context, I will discuss 2 different geographical areas. First, the Alpine one, and then the Lake Trasimeno. So according to the Alpine area, Pietro Pavesi is normally considered to be the founder of the discipline in Italy, and the most specific moment that is considered as to be a kind of watershed in the history of limnology in Italy is the discovery of pelagic fauna in lake systems. For instance, with the term pelagic fauna is referred zooplankton, and he introduced this discovery in a letter to, it's me.
Audio, anyone has a...
Sorry, Jeep's thing is not muted.
Yeah, he already switched it on.
Okay, it's fine, in a letter to Cavanna in 1877, there's the first introduction to this discovery. And for instance, he published 2 different articles on the topic in 1879, and then he provided a more complete framework in 1883. Altra serie di ricerche sulla fauna pelagica nei laghi italiani. There it's...
Nois, aneu acabant, sisplau.
Huh?
Apaguen els micros, el personal, pues si no se mete.
So somebody has their micro on, I
Somebody
think,
fixed, okay.
Yeah.
Somebody in the,
in the room.
Yeah.
you can go.
Okay. So I said that the volume published in 1893 is the more complete one, published by Pavesi, and there are 2 different issues or questions that he addressed in this volume. The first one is the phylogenetic origin of zooplankton or fauna pelagica, pelagic fauna, and then the variety and the biogeographical distribution of species inhabiting the lakes. And I would say that it was not only a kind of debate within the Italian limnological tradition, but instead was a shared one into a broader scientific discussion, at least at a European level. So just to give a broader picture of the limnological tradition in Italy, I did this kind of scheme that it's very graphically not very well done, not very beautiful, but I think it's possible to grab the concept from that. And I said that Pietro Pavesi was the founder of the Italian limnology, and he had 2 pupils or disciples, Marco De Marchi and Rina Stellamonti. Marco De Marchi was a mecenate, a kind of patron and sponsor, and so he founded a lot of scientific research in Italy, not only the field of limnology, but more generally into the field of marine natural sciences. And he published new works on limnobiology. Then Rina Stellamonti is the one who published a lot of research about Italian lake system, and with her activity, it's possible to say that there was the establishment of the discipline in Italy. And also she was interesting, the first Italian woman to have a permanent position in an Italian university. Edgardo Baldi was her disciple, and he was also the first director of the Istituto Italiano di Idrobiologia, the Italian Institute of Hydrobiology, that is located at a villa that Marco De Marchi founded to host the institute. And that's the place, a picture of the place in Verbania Pallanza in northern Italy, founded in 1938. So going to another context, Lake Tresmeno, that was another interesting site or significant site for limnological research in Italy, and it attracted the interest for scientific research since the 17th century, at least. And for instance, the picture on the left is a map of Lake Trasimeno provided by Livio Eusebio Perugino in 1602, and moving very, very fast to the 20th century. Pietro Frosini, Edgardo Baldi, that was the director of the Italian Institute of Hydrobiology, and Osvaldo Polimanti, all of them began a limnological study of the lake in the first half of the 20th century. And Osvaldo Polimanti was the founder and the first director of the Stazione Idrobiologica del Lago Trasimeno. And he was a physiologist at the Faculty of Medicine in Perugia. And he also discussed which was the mission of the station. He said that there were 2 main purposes. The first one was the discussion of the hydrobiological issues of the lake in general and freshwater fishing in particular. And also it's interesting that he struck the point that it was the only limnological station of that kind in Italy with the lasting character. So that was everything for the context of limnology, just a fast picture of the several cases. And then I will follow more or less the same structure in the context of marine sciences. I will provide first a general context, and I will go kind of fast, and then I will address the Spanish case and the Portuguese one. To what concern the general context, I've tried here to provide at least few main channels of development for marine ecology. First, the research voyages through research vessels and field explorations, and then the role of plankton studies, and then an institutional perspective. Regarding plankton studies, there's been a few pioneers in this field. For instance, Victor Hansen, Ernst Haeckel, and Hans Ritter. And Victor Hansen, who is the one who coined the term plankton to refer to those microorganisms, was also the first to scientifically and systematically study marine plankton, and especially with the plankton expedition. And there's the title page of that volume on the right. Whereas for research voyages, I will go very fast, but because also I think that everybody here knows those expeditions. For instance, the Challenger, the Danish Oceanographic Expedition, and the Michael Sars. All of them, and not only that, had a very important role for the establishment of the discipline. And regarding the institutional perspective and the research stations, I put just two different scenarios in the American context, in two different sides of the US. The Atlantic side with the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and the Pacific one with the Scripps, founded in 1903. And going to the Mediterranean, I think that it's interesting to mention at least these two research stations. One in the biological station of the University of Cagliari, and both are in the Italian context. And that one in Cagliari has been founded by Ermanno Gigliotos in 1909. And this quote, this quote is from the volume of Charles Kofoid published in 1910 during his trip in Europe exploring the phenomenon of a biological station. In here, he provided just a few details about like the structure or the infrastructure of the building. And the other one is the Istituto Centrale di Biologia Marina di Messina, founded in 1916 with a very broad aim of contributing to Italian seas physical, chemical, and biological studies. But going even closer, let's say, with a kind of Iberian scenario. We discuss first the Portuguese context, and then I address the Spanish one. And to what concerns the Portuguese context, I think that at least the 3 research stations were founded in the second half of the 19th century there. And among them, there were the Estação de Zoologia Marítima Dr. Augusto Nobre, then the Aquário Vasco da Gama, that is going to be the focus of my discussion afterwards, and then the Laboratorio de Zoologia Experimental de Lessa de Palmeira. And in that early context, 2 main researchers were the most influential scientists. One was Augusto Nobre, and the other one was Alfredo Magalhães Ramalho. And also it's interesting to mention that the journal Annais de Ciências Naturais, that has been published between 1894 and 1910, was a journal specialized in the field of natural sciences with few publications regarding marine studies. And for instance, on the right, there is a paper that has been published in that journal by Augusto Nobre discussing the foundation of the Laboratorio Marittimo de Lessa da Palmeira in 1896. It's this article. But going to the issue of the case of the Aquário Vasco da Gama, this one the aquarium has been founded in 1898, and the early years were kind of problematic with organizational and technical problems. And just to give a little bit of the institutional history of the place, it has been under the management of the Ministry of the Navy, and in 1909, it was assumed by the Portuguese Society of Natural Sciences. And although there's been some research at the aquarium before the foundation of the biology research station officially, the biological station has been founded in 1918. And in that moment, Augusto Celestino da Costa, that was the director of the time, drafted the program and discussed the usefulness of having a research station associated to the aquarium. And normally, he said in that volume that those places have three main purposes: scientific research, educational, and industrial purposes. And one of the essential elements of those stations was to have a research vessel to do field research. So the research vessel Albacora was the vessel of the Aquarium Vasco da Gama, and in that quote, Celestino da Costa mentioned and pointed out which was how important was for a biological station dedicated to marine sciences to have a research vessel. And for instance, he said that every biological station has a good ship or strives to have one. The Finnish ship is one of the essential elements of a biological station. But the research vessel Albacora arrived in Lisbon only in 1924, in December 1924, so in the end of the year, through the activity of Alfredo Magalhães Ramalho, that was the director of the station at that moment. And the Albacora was an interesting case and a very good acquirement for the biological station, because it was exclusively dedicated to scientific research. And it means that it was not a gunboat or a warship readapted for scientific purposes, but it was already built for research aims. And that was a replica of the Armaware Hansen, so it was not an original project. And the Armaware Hansen at the time was one of the best medium-sized research vessel available. And the Albacora aim was twofold: oceanography and fishery. And those two documents that I put here as pictures are the one on the left, the document that said how much they paid to get the Albacora and who paid for that. That was the Portuguese Navy. And the one on the right is a document certifying that the Albacora was actually arriving in Lisbon at that day. Okay, so now I will discuss the scientific research that has been done at the Aquarium Vasco da Gama through the Albacora. And I thought that the division according to these three different fields of inquiry is the more appropriate for the discussion. And the first one is marine biology, plankton, and the oceanography. And I will say that this division provides a complete picture of the activity that has been carried out over there. Regarding marine biology, it's another 3 points division. I would say that it's possible to discuss pelagic species. So, I mean, the research about pelagic species and big pelagic species like tuna, and small like sardines, then eel, and then crustaceous and mollusks. Regarding pelagic species, I put here who are the main expert on one side on tuna, that it was Fernando Frade, and all the main publication on the field. And regarding sardines, Alfredo Magalhães Ramalho. And also, according to the biography of Alfredo Magalhães Ramalho, it's possible to say that sardines were his long life research project. what was very interesting for him. And regarding Hill, Gandolfi Horniald was the major expert of this species, and he did research not only in Portugal but all around the Iberian Peninsula, because he did also research in Spain on the biology of eel, but also at a European level. He devoted to the study of the biology of this species, and in the field of crustaceous and mollusks, there was Vilela Herculano, who conducted research on mollusks and crustacean. And in the field in crustacean, he published both original research and also edited a publication about the zoological catalog of about crustacean of Don Carlos I. And in the field of plankton, I divided into two different points. The first one is a general historical coordinates about the history of plankton research in Portugal, and then a specific context of Alberto Candeias. And in the field of plankton and historical coordinates at the Portuguese level, I think it's possible to divide into three main steps. The first one is with Augusto Nobre, with the first article probably published in Portuguese on that field, on the field of plankton, entitled Sobre a distribuição dos organismos fluctuantes na costa do Porto, in 1897. And after this publication by Augusto Nobre, Luis Carrizo published his PhD thesis entitled Materiais para estudo do plâncton na costa portuguesa in 1911. And but Carrizo did his PhD on plankton and on marine ecology, and then he delved into botanical studies. So he did not continue his studies on plankton. And I will say that a three major moment of plankton research at the Portuguese context was with Alberto Candeias. That was a researcher at the Aquarium Vasco da Gama and the specialist on plankton at the biological station. And here I put all his writings from 1926 to 1938, just to show how he was publishing about the topic in Portugal. And I also think that he was the first to publish that much on the field of plankton in Portugal. So, oceanography. In the field of oceanography, I think that the research that has been carried out at the Aquarium Vasco da Gama can be divided into four main areas of inquiry. The first one is the oceanographic condition along the Portuguese coast, then the outlet, the estuary of the Tagus River, then the Algarve region, and then the Strait of Gibraltar region. And about the oceanographic conditions along the Portuguese coast, I think that those were the object of research all over the years between 1925 and 1940. And those 15 years were the 15 years of activity of the research vessel Albacora. And so there was not like a specific moment where they started a research program to address the scientific and the oceanographic condition of the Portuguese coast. And on those two maps on the slide, the first, those are of an expedition made in 1927, and they display the development of isothermal and isohalines all around the Portuguese coast. And for instance, the one on the left is about the surface level, and the one on the right is about 50 meters of depth. So moving at a more specific place, the Tagus River area. In that case, it's possible to find a specific moment where researchers at the Aquarium Vasco da Gama started a research project about the oceanographic condition of that place, of that geographical area. It was in 1936, and at least for two reasons. The first one is because of the geographical proximity of the Aquarium Vasco da Gama, but it was located at the estuary of the Tagus River. And also because normally those kind of places are kind of interesting because of the interaction between salt water and fresh water. So just to see how those two different kind of chemical waters interact. And then going a little bit southwards, the Algarve region. And I said here an oceanographic point of view. And I will discuss in particular the expedition that they made in the Algarve between May and September 1931 with the Albacora. And the one on the right is an interesting volume because it's an unpublished scientific report, a quite long one because it's around 100 pages of scientific report with all the discussion of the scientific results and data collection at the scientific expedition to the Algarve. And here, that one has been written by Luciano Senadentinho, that was the closest collaborator of Alfredo Magalhães Ramalho, and it started with the geographical focus of the research in the Algarve, and then he discussed several issues. For instance, the meteorological conditions, chemical and physical parameters of the water, and then the most interesting part, I will say, it's about how those kind of physical and chemical and meteorological condition of the environment affect tuna biology and behavior. And that's especially because of an interest about fishery and tuna fishing. So how those kind of how this kind of abiotic condition of the environment affect the biology of the species, and how it helps to address fishery instances. So going even southern, the Strait of Gibraltar region, and in that case, the Albacora conducted oceanographic research during the 4 years from 1927 to 1930, and further surveys in 1934. 9 expeditions were carried out. 9 expeditions, 6 between 1927 and 1930, and 3 in 1934. And the data collected have been published in 4 different publications. And that interesting part, I will say, is about that it was not an isolated scientific effort by Portuguese scientists, but it was the International Council of the Exploration of the Sea that decided that it was an international scientific program involving Spain and Portugal collaborating. And the interesting part in that case is that an intergovernmental body decided to engage 2 different countries to study and to address the same scientific instances, but in 2 different kind of geographical sectors. So, for instance, the Portuguese scientists were more into more into the Atlantic side of the Strait of Gibraltar region, and the Spanish one more into the Mediterranean one. Here on the right, there is another unpublished scientific report written always by Luciano Senadentinho, and there he discussed the scientific expedition made at 1929 in the Strait of Gibraltar region. And if that one is an unpublished report, then I put also on the left side of the slide all the scientific publication made by Portuguese scientists regarding the Strait of Gibraltar, and there are 4, for instance. And I would also say try to give a very resumed point of view about the scientific research done by Portuguese scientists about the issue of currents, of oceanographical currents at the Strait of Gibraltar, because they said that the deep Mediterranean current from the Strait of Gibraltar extends northwards along the Portuguese coast and southwards along the Moroccan coast. And so basically they were discussing the issue of deep Mediterranean current and surface Atlantic current at the Strait of Gibraltar, and try to collect data to further explore this kind of phenomenon that was already known in scientific literature at that time. Going to the Spanish context, I try to put here what were the main research station in the field in the Portuguese case between the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. And for instance, there were three main research centers: the Estación de Biología Marina de Santander, and then that was the first one, and then the two laboratories in Baleares and Malaga. And it's interesting to see that those three research centers then became part of the Instituto Español de Oceanografía, founded in 1914 by Odón de Bueno y del Cos. That was one of the founders of oceanography in Spain. And on the left, there's an example of one of the vessels they use, and the Boletín de Pesca as one of the scientific journals. And I try to put here all the information about the Laboratorio de Biología Marina de Málaga, trying to address which were the three main areas of inquiry according to the same scheme of the Portuguese one. And for instance, marine biology, plankton, and oceanography. And in the case of marine biology, I think that three species, tuna, swordfish, and sardines, were of interest of the people working at the Laboratorio de Biología Marina de Málaga, and that Fernando de Bueno y Lozano was the major expert in the biological field of marine sciences, and he was the son, one of the two sons of I don't know if there were only two, but of Odón de Bueno. And then in the field of plankton, Miguel Masuti Alzamora and Francisco de Paula Navarro were the two experts of plankton. And in the field of physical oceanography, Rafael de Buen y Lozano, that was another son of Odón de Buen, published interesting research on the topic. And for instance, according to the research did at the first half of the 19th century, the first decades of the 20th century in Malaga, the Bay of Gibraltar and the Strait of Gibraltar were of interest. In the case of the Bay of Gibraltar, Rafael de Buen published an interesting paper in 1924 collecting and discussing all the oceanographical results of scientific expedition with the vessel Averroes, discussing hydrodynamics of the place. And in the case of the Strait of Gibraltar, I put here in this slide many information, maybe too much for just one slide, but I'm also approaching the conclusion. And on the left, I according to the research done at the laboratory of Malaga, the expedition did at the Strait of Gibraltar, and they began in 1919 with the Commission of the Mediterranean saying that suggesting that Spain should have studied the oceanographical condition of the area. And in this first early phase of the study of the Strait of Gibraltar at Malaga, as part of the Instituto Español de Oceanografía, is enriched by a work published for the Boletín de Pesca by this French naturalist Julien Marie-Olivier Toulet, that was a visiting researcher, let's say, at the Instituto Español de Oceanografía, and he gave also a kind of state-of-the-art article regarding the oceanographical expedition at the Strait of Gibraltar. And for instance, all the historical coordinates that he mentioned were started in 1828 with one of the first, according to him, expedition at the Strait of Gibraltar by Dumont d'Urville with the vessel Astrolabion, then with Carpenter after 50 years in 1870, and then with Italian researcher with Magnaghi, or even with Russian researcher doing research at the Strait of Gibraltar. And if, let's say, that was a first kind of moment in the history of the Strait of Gibraltar, in the oceanographical history of the Strait of Gibraltar, with other expeditions like the Michael Sars or the Danish oceanographical expedition with the vessel Thor, there was another kind of different moment in the history of the oceanography over there because of the more sophisticated instruments and so on. There were different or more elaborated or detailed data collection. And then I will say that after those kind of expedition began a kind of Iberian momentum about the history of oceanography regarding the Strait of Gibraltar, with Spanish and Portuguese, and Spanish getting to the issue of the Strait of Gibraltar before the Portuguese scientist. And with Raphael de Buen published, there are further articles about the physical oceanographical condition of the Strait of Gibraltar. On the right, there is a paper he published for one of the journal of the International Council of the Exploration of the Sea. And 1929 was one of the moment where there was much more research dedicated to the Strait of Gibraltar with the vessel Sauen. For instance, 11 expeditions have been done between 1929 and 1934. And in the article Raphael de Buen published in 1930 that I was referring to, he said that the work carried out in 1929 by Spain and Portugal covers the Strait of Gibraltar and the Spanish Sea, he said. The numbers of stations is very high, enabling us to take a major step forward in our knowledge of the hydrographic regime of this region. And Raphael de Buen pointed out also how the deep Mediterranean current do not flow completely out of the Strait of Gibraltar. Well, that was everything. I just reported here 3 main conclusions that I want to emphasize. The first one is because of the general background of the presentation that has been on those kind of a research movement, the dual historical background of this context, at least just to say that it was a kind of European phenomenon in the second half of the 19th century, spreading in the United States of America and elsewhere in the first half of the 20th century. And then I really would like to say that role of plankton research in both contexts, in the context of marine sciences and in the context of lake studies of limnology, as it has been a kind of shared historical momentum relevant for the development of both ecological discipline. And then just to conclude about the Strait of Gibraltar and a kind of Iberian oceanography that is possible to address. And here just a few references that I've been referring to during the presentation. And thank you so much. I hope I've not been too long.
Not at all. Please. So maybe you can stop sharing so that we can see people in the audience. If they have questions on the specific slides, you would need to share again. Sorry about that. Yeah, thanks a lot for this. Lots of information indeed. And I'm sure there are questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have questions? Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this. I think that, the point about plankton is a very important conclusion, to show that this is a very clear link between the two different fields of studies. But I wanted to go into something else that we discussed the other day already.
Let's go back there.
Yeah, let's go back to the 18th centuries. I was really interested in this slide you showed about Lake Trasimeno, mostly because there was a map from 1602, I think. And you have this thing where you kind of make priority claims about a lot of people, where you say that these guys like Pavesi and Forel were the first to do something, and then you showed one of the last slides, somebody in 1829 being the first to study temperature in the Strait of Gibraltar. There's people who do that before, right? Not systematically. I think that is where we're going with this. Because the one thing, and I think maybe the Trasimeno Lake is a better example, the one thing I would like to know is, what do you think is the real difference between these guys that are going there in the 18th century, the early 19th century, trying to investigate the lake, and then the ones that you say are actually the first that are important? What is going on there? And I've got a hypothesis which I think might work in both cases, Trasimeno and Gibraltar, that they are historically important places, right? They are important places for human history, and archaeologists like the kind of places where wars have been fought and so on. Does that play a role in the early interest in being located at those specific places?
I will say that, well, the major difference, at least in my opinion, is that in one case you have isolated efforts, and the other one, like in early attempt to study lake system, you have isolated efforts. So it's more a kind of how many people were involved into that, and So the difference is in isolated rather than collective effort, and it means that there were a shared scientific interest and relevance to the same scientific object of studies. And then what's the other point of the question?
What I'm wondering is the reason that Lake Trasimeno was one of the main places for early Italian, is that related to its role in human history rather than anything specific about that lake, marine?
Okay. Maybe it's because the geographical location in the center of in the really center of the Italy, and close to, let's say, not very close to Rome, but there was a university, a very old university over there, not that far. Yeah, and also maybe because I also have this kind of thing that depending of the characteristic of the environment, maybe people get more involved into some places than the other. And the Lake Trasimeno is not a very deep lake, so it means that probably it's like easier to find also from a instrumental perspective some properties that you are looking for, rather than, for example, Lake Como. It's very deep. So
it is actually something specific about
and also it's not, it's not like there are not so many other lakes over close to Lake Trasimeno, I would say. Maybe I'm wrong, but as far as I remember, is one of the very few over there, and it has a huge extension. Okay, it's not like a small one. So maybe that's another reason why. But yeah.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Just going back to that. Go ahead, Effie. Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Pier Luigi, for a very thorough and interesting talk, which is really particularly interesting to me, as one of the things I'm looking into is also marine science stations, attempts to have proper marine science stations in Greece. From the, let's say, beginning of the 20th century until roughly World War II. And the people in Greece who were involved in these efforts to have marine science stations held Italian marine science in really high esteem. That's why in the first experiment to have such a station in an Athenian coastal suburb in 1914, they invited an Italian specialist, Station Vinciquera, to supervise the works in the station. So I was wondering, I have two questions basically. The first one is, have you come across any Italian involvement in the creation of a hydrobiology station in the island of Rhodes in the mid-1930s? So during Italian occupation of the Dodecanese, because they are involved, but the specifics are not very well defined. The Italians are involved. There was an Italian director, an Italian architect who built the station, Armando Bernabiti. Have you heard anything about this?
I don't know what.
You don't know. Because obviously they
Involved
were.
into what?
Sorry?
You said involved into the foundation of?
Of a hydrobiology station in the island of Rhodes in the Dodecanese, which started its operations in 1936, I think, or 1937, which was during the time that Rhodes was under Italian occupation. So I was just wondering whether you've come across any information about this.
No.
No, it's fine.
I'm sorry.
It's fine. And my other question is,
If I may, that's super interesting. So if Pier Luigi doesn't know, somebody needs to know.
yeah, doesn't know who does.
Cool.
Does. Yeah, that's true. We have to look it up more closely, I guess. So the other question is about, so I was wondering, the whole marine science station movement, as you described it, or as the scholarship has basically coined it, started from Italy and then expanded to the rest of Europe and then to the US. Do we have a more like nuanced justification why it actually started from Italy? Was it just like the pioneering figure of Dorn? Was it like a coincidence because we have the zoological station in Naples and that was a role model for any other like similar projects? Was it that, I don't know, other more like practical reasons, like Italy being like a hub of marine biology and ichthyology? And did Italy have many departments, academic departments, more than like other European nations? I don't know.
Yeah, but I didn't want to do like only an Italian phenomenon because it was like broader than that. And apart from Italy, there were, for instance, many stations in England or France, more or less at the same time.
Yeah, about this, but I'm just wondering why it took so much. I mean, why it went to the US at a later stage, like why didn't like happen simultaneously? And also, I was also wondering because, for example, the Greek marine biology community, the very, very small one, a handful of people, considered Italy to be like the hub of marine biology. And I never found like a justification for this that went beyond the simple fact that, oh, Italy is the hub of ichthyology. We should like invite them over. We should depend on their like research. So in my mind, Italy was more widely acknowledged as a hub of like
from what I know, maybe the idea to have an aquarium and a biological station in the aquarium as also money resources was like a nice like move by Dorn while founding the research center in Naples, and also like to the point to not create a station very far away from a big city. It was another strategy to also looking for funding for research. Yeah, but I don't know, because there were also many other research stations in the other side of the Mediterranean. I just mentioned the Naples one because that's true that everywhere they refer to this station in historical sources. But also there were, for instance, other marine research centers in Morocco or in Tunisia, or so also in the African coast. They are also. So it was a broader historical phenomenon, not just an Italian or a French or a UK English one.
Okay, it's just that because of the Naples station is more pronounced and like widely known, probably.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
more or
also
less it's the same in the case of limnology with Plon. That was like a very important one in that field. Yeah, so that's the reason why I put like in one moment Plon and the other one Naples, because they somehow correspond in the two different fields.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you.
What was the gap, or what was the contribution you would say of the station per se with respect to what came before that? I mean, there must have been some kind of ecological research. I don't know if not on a much ongoing basis, but as you mentioned, that usually, efforts not very organized, but surely there was some kind of ecological research, marine research before, but stations.
I am not sure there has been some ecological research before. That's but that's my perspective.
So ecological research, you claim, or the emergence of ecological research is very closely tied to the appearance of these stations,
That's one of the ways ecology developed, at least in my opinion. And those kind of movement has been one of the channel through which ecology developed. But I think that the second half of the 19th century was because of the intensification of studies on natural sciences, because of the fact that people were into the field doing natural scientific research and exploring environment to the environment. That moment has been one of the most important in the history of ecological science, and not before that. So yeah.
Yeah, perhaps I made this question because I remember this second slide where you speak of the relationship between the research environment and the research approach, so that, and this idea that ecology, studying organisms in their natural environment might be somehow tied to.
But for instance, just to say that as far as I know, the first institute or the first ecological society has been founded in UK in 1912. So if you take like an institutional perspective, just to say, well, ecology as a scientific discipline has been founded. There was scientific research in the 17th century, but you do not have like an institution where they have like publications, or they have a research center where they were developing those kind of research. So yeah,
there is. The Royal Society does that, does publications, does sponsors.
But the Royal Society is not completely dedicated to ecology.
No, but it does certain things.
Yes,
In
but the point,
semi-structural way.
but yeah. But the question is that ecological research, or is something,
I mean, I think that's the question we're asking you. So that is.
Yeah, I don't know if I have an answer for it. My point of view is that you have scientific ecological research starting from the second half of the 19th century. Starting that was like the moment where there was a changing in the approach toward nature and toward natural phenomena because an institutional changing, for instance, the British Ecological Society or the station movement that I was referring to, and yeah, mainly because of that. But that's my opinion.
Can I just say one thing very short about that? I mean, the way you present it now, I think you have a point, right? I said that before, and I think this is something that is really, the sources are there, you can argue this point, but the way you present it now, it seems like it's a difference of scale only. Like the guys in the Royal Society were just too few of them, they didn't have enough funding, they didn't have the right things, whereas later there's a critical mass and then things happen. But I think there must be something else, right?
Yeah. But I don't think that the Royal Society were too few people to do scientific research, but there was not that aim. You know, maybe they were involved in chemical analysis, in physical analysis, in biological one. But you can really say that there was ecological studies in the field of marine sciences, for instance, because of the Royal Society. I don't know. Also, yeah.
I think something to discuss later.
There's Alessandra with.
Yeah. But before we go to Alessandra, Darwin is one difference between the two periods, right?
Yeah.
So usually ecology, the word ecosystem is coined in 1870, I think, or actually 1920. But 1920. But the word ecology is coined by Haeckel in 1970, and it's all the Darwinians trying to make sense of how living beings operate in their medium. So I don't think that was in the agenda of the Royal Society in any meaningful way, right?
I agree with that, yes, absolutely. And I think that's the kind of dimension that you would need to add to just saying
Which to be fair, he does in a couple of papers. So your paper on limnology, you're talking about Darwin as the framework. Cool.
Yeah, really good point.
I forgot about that.
About Darwin. Who cares about Darwin? Alessandra, please, sorry.
Yes, here am I. Thank you, Pier Luigi. It was very interesting. And I have two questions. The first concerning the limnological tradition, which I'm totally unfamiliar with. And I was wondering if when reading Forbes, Forel, and Pavesi, did you notice any differences concerning the way they conceptualize the relationship between the land and the lake? And the first. And then the second thing is the quotation you made from Kingsland 2018 concerning the influence of the environment you study on the conceptualization of the environment. And this is very, very interesting. But I was wondering, do you have any examples of, or are there any examples in the literature of ecological concepts that were born in the aquatic environments, which are transferred to the ecology of terrestrial environment? Because as far as I can read, but I mean, I could read in the past, but of course I didn't read everything. It was mainly the contrary. Terrestrial concepts imported into marine and possibly aquatic sciences. Thanks.
Okay, interesting. Well, the first question was about the relationship between land and lake. So you mean boundaries?
Yeah.
Okay.
Of course, the way it is conceptualized in the authors you were mentioning.
Yeah, but Forel, well, first, just to be honest, Pavesi did not published very scientific studies about limnology in the sense that mainly he was collecting, for example, trying to answer in the question what kind of species inhabiting the lakes he has studied. So that was more a kind of a taxonomical account rather than a proper limnological one. But I would say that especially in Forel and Forbes, the idea that the lake was completely isolated and then that was really a kind of microcosm in itself, it was a shared like feeling among all those kind of limnological scientists. And I will also say that I didn't mention that in the presentation, but Forel and Forbes, like Forbes introduced the term microcosm to refer to the lake, and Forel did the same afterwards, but without mentioning Forbes. So he used like the term microcosm to refer to a lake system without saying, well, that has been said by Forbes. So I wonder if they had like a kind of contact or interaction or not. But just to say that this kind of relationship between land and lake is discussed as, well, there is a lake with its own scientific and ecological dynamics, and then there's the there's the land. There is what is like what is part of the surroundings of the environmental of the lake, but it's not completely like a part of that dynamics. I don't know if I answered your question.
Totally, yes.
And to answer the other one, I will take the concept of the microphones to say that, to answer, because the term ecosystem has been introduced in 1935 by Arthur Tansley in the context of plant ecology and in a kind of philosophical discussion, because he never used the concept of ecosystem to do any kind of study in the field of botany or plant ecology, sorry. But a few studies that have been published about the history of the microcosm concept, they refer to the limnological tradition as the historical sources of the concept of microcosm, of the development of the concept of microcosm. And for instance, they say, well, maybe the terms microcosm can be an antecedent of the term of the more well-known today concept of ecosystem. And then the first scientist who used the term ecosystem was a limnologist in 1942, and he was Raymond Lindemann. He was a student of Hutchinson, and he did the first study of a lake considering the lake as a microcosm. So actually the first study that has been done on an ecosystem using the term ecosystem was by a limnologist. So that's just to say that this transfer of knowledge from terrestrial ecology to marine one, maybe it's not always, maybe it has not always been like that. But also, I have another example, but I'm not sure, because the law of the ecological succession that it's of Clements has another kind of intellectual history in limnology, in the sense that I'm not sure you can apply, for instance, the law of ecological succession into lakes, but you need, let's say, something different. And so in that case, for example, for instance, in the context of the succession of the ecosystem, the life of the ecosystem, in the field of limnology, you have different approaches. And I have another example for that, but referring to the interaction between the biotic and the abiotic and the role of aquatic environments. If you look at the plankton, the study of plankton in lakes, you see that, for instance, as early as the 80s, the 1880s, so in 19th century, you see that they were trying to find a reason why plankton has migration, the migration of plankton according to abiotic causes, in the sense that the plankton has this kind of movement that during the night they go to the surface, and during the day they go to the depth of the lake, and that's because they are kind of escaping the sunlight. And so that's another example of the interaction between biotic and abiotic condition in a kind of lake system, and you see that very clearly while looking at historical sources in the field of limnology and so aquatic environments. And yeah, I think it's.
I have a couple of questions, but I have one very related to that, which is you talk both in the paper that I mentioned in the Journal of Historical Biology and in your presentation today about lake systems.
Yes.
And I don't know if those were their terms in late 19th century and early 20th century, or is more related to this other history of ecosystems in the 30s and 40s. Okay.
Yes.
Because the thing is that I find it very interesting that there is an acknowledgement, an early acknowledgement of the effects of the environment in marine organisms and pelagic fauna and life, so plankton in lakes. But I think when the concept of ecosystem is coined, there is a top-down causality, which is being introduced, which is there is not only an effect of the physical environment upon organisms. Organisms can also, in what would later be called in the 40s and 50s, the feedback loop.
Yes.
They can also affect the physical environment themselves.
Yes.
Yeah? And today, people studying the biological pump from the 1970s nowadays note that for instance, phytoplankton can affect the biochemistry of the oceans. That notion comes later. Yeah, you haven't seen any sort of indication, I suppose.
No.
Okay,
No.
that was a question. Did you have a question about?
Do you have any kind of more explicit claim about the lakes being a natural laboratory, because it's clearly implicit, you know, that for L even?
I have I don't know if it's a claim, but it's something else. I have the expedition of the American scientists at the Great Lake region between US and Canada, where they were really exploring those kind of environment, doing kind of expedition over there. And they are such big places that they really need to do and organize an expedition over there. And so it's a kind of natural laboratory, I would say.
What I mean is that the mention of the lake being a microcosm and also of being, you know, suitable for its study, for being a microcosm, for being an enclosed place that is partially isolated from its surrounding, that resonates with, you know, systems framing, certainly early ecological thinking.
Also, I just
how to isolate and study, and that has appeared also in, for example, justifications about why the Mediterranean is a suitable object of research for ecologically, you know, for being a semi-closed sea, namely, or the Baltic.
Yeah. Just to be honest, there's a paper published, I don't know how many years ago, but maybe 10, where the idea of the lake as a microcosm, as a first paradigm in limnology, has been questioned and challenged, in the sense that lakes are no longer that much isolated as Forbes was speaking about. So that's.
Do you think the early mention to microcosms entails any kind of epistemic uniqueness or significance for the community's attention to do research in lakes and then kind of export or extrapolate that knowledge to other kind of aquatic systems, marine systems,
If the word microcosm has been applied also outside.
or if the coinage of the term microcosms entail that special significance, right?
Well, in the field of limnology, the term microcosm meant a closed system of interaction. Then I would say that this idea of the lake as a microcosm as a unity and the idea of like a part of nature as system where there are like multiple interaction and the interconnectedness of things in nature has been a kind of issue in other fields of ecology. For instance, in plant ecology, the idea of a community, of an higher order, refer a little bit to this idea of the unit of nature. So that has been a kind of paradigm in ecology in the first half of the 20th century. Not only the idea of the lake as a unit, but the idea of this kind of the organismal approach to nature. Yeah.
Okay.
Can we ask another question related also to terminology, in this case, stations? Because you talk about field stations, but then you talk at the Albacora as a ship associated to a field station, which at the same time has what oceanographers called stations, which means points in which they take measurements. Can you trace a genealogy of that? So do you think, would you claim that the habit of calling stations to these points in which the ship takes a measurement can be traced back to the field station, or when does it start?
I don't think there's a history, a shared history, but maybe there is the idea that the vessel can be a station in itself, in the sense that you need, maybe sometimes you need to prepare scientifically the vessel that you are using to do scientific expedition, and maybe some measurements or some early studies of data you need to do at the moment that you are stop the vessel to do the data collection.
And so the ship as a laboratory.
Yes.
Which brings me to a very related question, which is study nature in nature, but that's not actually what you do in an aquarium. Yeah, you're by the sea, but you're fishing on a boat, and then you're taking specimens from your natural environment and bringing them to into your artificial environment. And I know of people who have written about that. We have this book here, Why Study Biology by the Sea, in which there's people who talk about the Naples station and make these kind of questions. So, because I mean, when you have scuba diving, then you're studying things in their own habitat, or these intertidal zone studies, which by the way, I think the US was pioneer in those in the late 19th century, which is you have places in which there are big tides, and then you can study at least some specimens in their habitat when the but the rest of the time you are basically taking things out of their habitat and then analyzing them in the aquarium, which is something, because they are alive, is much more than what Cuvier was doing, but well, it's not much more, it's different.
Yeah, but also because like you cannot go all the time like in the field to do studies. So reproducing nature is also useful from a practical point of view. But I was about to say something else. Yeah, that given that you have like as far as I understand, given that you have like so many kind of environmental context, each of them brings something more to what you are studying. So it's not the same time to study like a lake that is very deep, a lake that is not that deep, or also like a dune environment or other kind of things. So I would say that like the field of environmental sciences, if you look at the history, you have many histories, not according to how many environment you have, but all those kind of environment, they kind of have not their own stories, but somehow yes. So it's not the same, for instance, to go to the Alpine lakes or going to the lakes in the north, in North America. They bring different kind of experience, and even if you look like historically at them, because there was like the first attempt to do this kind of studies. So I don't know if it's interesting to see that the difference of the environments bring different kind of stories, if you look at that scientifically. But that's
I have one more question, if nobody's willing to jump in. Basically, I think first question by Jean hinted to that, but I don't know. The question would be, where is the politics, if at all, in this story? So what are the importance of these specific sites? You mentioned, by politics, I mean very widely, so imperial politics, but also political economy. So you mentioned fisheries,
okay,
for
yeah,
instance.
yeah,
I
yeah,
suppose
okay.
there was
Yes,
some
yes.
people putting money into those stations.
Yeah,
And,
I have something.
and the Italian station, Zorn, was German, if I'm not
Yes, yes.
mistaken. Yes, so the Italian was being financed by German science. So that sort of relationship, I was willing to hear a bit more.
Mhm. Yeah, and also I will say something about the idea of research centers as a place of scientific research, in the sense that that is true, but it's not only about scientific research. Because I don't know, but I've seen a strong relationship between what kind of species you study at those places and their usefulness from a fishery perspective. So basically, you study tuna and sardines, and you do not study other kind of fish that have no economical interest. So there was not only a pure, let's say, interest in scientific research, but there was a kind of connection about fishery and the economical interest of the species you have studied. For instance, sardines in Portugal is very important because of the it's culturally important, sardines in Portugal. And so they were studying sardines and not other kind of species that you have like in the Portuguese coast. Because they were important for the country and for the economy of the country. So you have in those places scientific interest, but not only pure interest in science, but also like an interest that is there is like connected to economical interest. Yeah.
Yeah, in relation to that one, would like to know more also about the motives underlying and the justifications given for research on phytoplankton, zooplankton, so things that are not of immediate or were not at any rate,
Well,
I guess, at the moment,
yeah,
of immediate interest, economic or political, or
so
that's what comes to mind.
Yeah. But in the case of plankton, I think that it comes a little bit later, just to that I don't know if it comes a little bit later, but yeah. I think it was not as much clear as it was in the case of sardines. So yeah. Yeah, because the scientific effort in sardine, I would say it was like bigger than the one in plankton. For instance, Ramalho was much more involved into research of sardines than Alberto Candellas was in the case of plankton. Yeah, I mean, in the Portuguese context, but I don't know elsewhere.
So we are just in time, an hour and a half after we started, but Pablo has one more question.
Now something came to mind, you know, the notion of ecological productivity, that in marine ecology is basically linked to plankton productivity.
The notion of?
ecological productivity, so the amount of nutrients that system produces basically, and then goes through the food web. Do you know if its emergence is somehow occurring in your period?
No,
No. Okay.
no. I think it's a little bit later. Maybe it's in the, I don't know where, and I don't remember, but there's a paper about a researcher a specialist of plankton in Spain, working at the Instituto Español de Oceanografía and in the US. Was one of the first to study those kind of things in Spain about the productivity of plankton and oceanography. Huh? No. It was a woman. I don't know. Later I will.
Because that is the link between fisheries and plankton studies, right?
And I was thinking about that it comes a little bit later, and so that the reason why plankton research was not as much involved in economical issues than sardines and other species. Yeah. So the economical connection with plankton it's a little bit more complicated.
Because you end your period in the 50s, right?
Yes.
But I think that thanks to him that in the 60s, NATO is carrying out productivity studies in the Mediterranean, for example, at the basin scale. So they already were, managing the concept. So it might emerge in that period.
I think so.
Probably alongside systems ecology.
Yeah.
One interesting thing is not exactly related to that, but is related to the uses of marine biology and plankton studies to physical oceanography. I remember a paper by Frasetto, an Italian researcher working for NATO, I think 1947, using plankton, zooplankton, I think, that the daily migration to trace currents. Because in the Strait of Gibraltar, you have the upper current from the Atlantic to the Mediterranean, and then the deep current from the Mediterranean out to the Atlantic. And because plankton was going up and down and then floating, you could see the square, basically. So you could see that it went on the surface from the Atlantic to the Mediterranean, then as it dove, it moved from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. That was his claim, and he was thinking of how to use plankton as tracers for physical oceanography, which I think today is probably more common according to what we heard. So today we won't continue our conversation over coffee because we will do so over Mirto, a wine that Pier Luigi brought us as a present. So thank you very much. And thanks a lot for everybody who will miss it. And see you next month with something almost as interesting. Bye-bye.